Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. Allison Skinner-Dorkenoo, Department of Psychology, University of Georgia, discusses her article, How Microaggressions Reinforce and Perpetuate Systemic Racism in the United States. She defines what microaggressions are and how they support white supremacy. Through subtle and slight processes, microaggressions protect and reinforce othering of people of color, with environmental exclusions, treating people of color as second class, and promoting ideas of inequality. Here's our discussion from October 27th, 2022.
I'm Allison Skinner-Dorkenoo. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Georgia.
Well, again, thank you for joining us. We're talking today about an article you wrote called How Microaggressions Reinforce and Perpetuate Systemic Racism in the United States. And maybe you could kind of give us an overview of what the article is about and what it hopes to accomplish.
Sure. So I think to summarize sort of my motivation with this paper was there has been certainly lots of sort of debate about what microaggressions are and, if they're real, if people are sort of being oversensitive, and not to minimize any of that sort of whatsoever, but another sort of piece to add to that puzzle was thinking about, even if there isn't someone to be offended or have their, feelings hurt or be upset by a microaggression, that we can also think about the ways that it's impacting society as a whole. And the way, even if there isn't a member of a marginalized group who's going to, have a negative reaction to something, it's impacting the rest of people within society to be exposed to these messages. And what I argue is that it's reinforcing systemic biases and racism by sort of normalizing these messages of sort of at a big picture level, saying that sort of white people are different from people of color, and that also many of these messages reinforce a notion that white people are in some ways superior to people of color, and that even if there's not a person to feel offended by that message, that's reinforcing these within our own minds and within our systems within society.
Yeah, and I think that comes across really well in the paper, and I think maybe we should start with kind of a general definition of what a microaggression is, and maybe if you want to talk a little bit about how it plays into the systemic racism you were talking about.
Sure. So I think a definition that is often used is something along the lines of everyday slights that people experience. So may or may not be intentional by the person or the institution that is sort of enacting the microaggression, but it's a sort of everyday slight that communicates. So as I mentioned, like this really originated out of people who, were feeling slighted by these things, sort of that they were feeling these everyday slights of getting these messages of like, you don't quite belong, you're not quite measuring up. So it's like these small ways in which that's communicated by the way our systems are set up, by the things that we say, by our expectations about different people, how they will speak and think and behave. And I think you said a second part of your question.
Yeah,
that I've now forgotten.
I want to get back to something you said in a minute, but the kind of how these microaggressions contribute to white superiority or systemic racism as a system, I guess.
Sure. So I think we really break it down in like looking at it in a whole bunch of different ways and talking about all these different microaggressions and how we can still see that reinforcing the same message. I think at a big picture level, and we can also talk about specific examples, we think about the ways in which microaggressions just sort of communicate difference. And so that could be things like how people often want to ask people what race they are. And typically this is not a question that is asked of people who look very clearly white. So this is a question that gets asked of people that maybe have some sort of ambiguous characteristics and the idea is like, I want to put you in a racial box and think about how to think about you. And also it's sort of cueing that, like, I'm othering you. I'm thinking of you of some, like, you're not on, and I need to know how to think about you. And so the fact that that is a question that's not equally asked of everybody suggests that this is sort of an othering thing. So we could think about children on a playground. A child starts school and they're surrounded by peers. And if they just looked around and looked at who are the people that get asked, what are you? That certain people get asked that and certain people don't get asked that. So it's this sort of othering notion of who are the types of people that we don't have to ask that question for? Who are the types of people that we do have to ask that question for? And that's just an example of one of these sort of subtle ways that we just are sort of creating this division of like white and then everyone else. And then also, we can think about lots of ways in which there's this sort of superiority notion. So things like having assumptions about intelligence, and maybe even saying something complimentary of complimenting a Black student on being really well spoken. So that's positive, that's a compliment, but also what is that implying? That's implying that I had very low expectations of you. I didn't think you would be able to do this, and based on your group membership, based on your race. And so there are these subtle ways that sometimes can even seem positive, but are communicating that there's differences between white people and people of color, and also that I have positive associations and expectations with white people and less so maybe with people in other groups.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, is that the white is kind of prioritized or seen as the norm, correct? And then everything else is kind of needs to be explained.
Right.
So the other thing that, I kind of wanted to get back to this idea that, it's a slight or it's a minor infraction, and we kind of are able to, in some regard, dismiss them because they're these smaller micro actions. Mm-hmm. And isn't that part of the fact that they're based mainly in language, correct? Like the language we use kind of unconsciously is the problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're not just based in language, but I think we can also think about them still being really subtle. So for example, like environmental microaggressions, we could think about. So I know that I've walked into a number of different academic spaces, and there'll be like pictures all on the wall of all of the very important historical people. And maybe I won't see a single woman there. And so like every single person there is a man, and there's this cue there of like, who are the people that we venerate? Who are the people that are important? Who belongs in this space? And we can most certainly think about that with many people of color experiencing that same thing of not seeing anyone from their racial and ethnic group, and also potentially gender for women. And then there's the intersectional categories as well, but sort of thinking about, but that's a subtle thing, and that a lot of us won't even notice it. And even if you are sort of not represented by that, you might not explicitly notice it. You might say, I don't really feel like I belong there, but you might not even recognize all of the cues that have led you to have that sort of feeling. So I think that in lots of ways, it's sort of things that can pass by, and maybe you notice it more when you're feeling slighted by it, but that lots of other people could be there in that same situation. And since it's not a thing that's directed toward them and makes them feel a lack of belonging, or a lack of value or respect, might not even notice and might sort of have that pass right by them and not even catch it, especially if no one points it out.
Yeah, and I think that the environmental, which I kind of want to talk about in a little bit, but a little bit more in depth, but the kind of part and parcel of that is our media that we consume, correct? And there are a lot of kind of not beyond just representation, there are microaggressions in the media we consume too. And one of the things I found fascinating was the effect it had. And I kind of like you to talk to us about the effect of microaggressions, not only on the person that it's aimed against, but the person who is consuming it, I guess.
Right. I'm not sure if this is what you are thinking about, but one of the biggest things that I think about with that is who is represented in terms of, well, when we think about criminals. So I think I can't remember the statistics on this, but, local news, like highly overrepresents perpetrators of crimes that are people of color, but especially Black people, Black men. And so essentially when we look at, what is the message that like we might get a picture along with it? Also, probably the picture we see is a mugshot as opposed to like the picture of like the dad with his kids. So it's like, are we getting a sympathetic image or are we getting an image that they look like a bad person that we shouldn't like? And that we can see if we sort of go through and analyze this. There was this really wild example that I show my students sometime from a local newspaper where it was like a story about a man who had I forget, it was like he had his car stolen, and then there was like something about a criminal, and like the big picture, and the two stories are right next to each other, and the big picture, the guy who had his car stolen, I think was Black, and his picture was very big and it was very close to the crime story. And so it was really, even when they were like highlighting that something bad happened to him and this person was victimized by crime, you could very easily glance at that and come away with the same sort of message that all of this other media has of like who are like the sort of criminals and the bad people, and how that is co-varies with race in terms of media and what gets represented. And then on the other side, and I can't remember if we talked about this in the paper, but there's also this way underrepresentation when we look at victimization, like white women and girls, when they are victimized, tend to like get a dramatic amount of media attention. So there's this like huge outpouring and like big response from media, and it's a big deal, versus when it's women and girls of color, or like men, like Black men being victimized, then it's like a very might not get any attention at all. And I think we can look at, for example, like awful sort of statistics with regards to Native American women, of like missing and murdered Native women that like never make any never ever get discussed within the mainstream media at all. And so looking at like who do we even acknowledge their like victimization and their experiences and like devote media attention, but also other sort of like resources of search and rescue and so on to actually like try and remedy and rectify the victimization.
Yeah, and that was a big topic here in Cleveland back when Anthony Sowell was apprehended, because all of his victims were drug users, prostitutes, Black women who had fallen through the cracks. And a lot of them had court dates coming up, and they just missed the court dates, and no one looked for them, and no one was out, searching and they just disappeared. Mm-hmm. Part of that is a function of the criminal justice system in which people just disappear, they move out of states or whatever. And it really brought home kind of there was no media coverage of those people, but a white woman goes missing and it's on 60 Minutes does a whole thing on it, right?
Right. And I think we can also think about that. Just made me think about another sort of stark example of I don't remember his name, but the man who did the shootings in Atlanta, the spa shootings, and the, police officers being interviewed afterwards, and they were like, well, he just had a bad day. Whereas like what, and this was, a white man who killed like multiple Asian women. And yeah, like what is the way that we're talking about different people who engage in, have some of the same experiences or engage in some of the same behavior, but how is it characterized? So he's not like a terrible person, and he certainly isn't a representative of his race. It's not like, oh, we can't trust white men now because they might be murderers. Of course not. It's just about this guy, and this guy isn't even all bad. He just had a bad day.
Yeah, and I want to return to, the one being a representative of the entire culture in a minute, but I wanted to return to kind of this, the idea of the environmental attacks. And one of the things that I found really interesting in the article was we kind of all know the monument story now because so many people were torn down, but the Confederate flag, there was something in the article that said, corroborated by research showing that support for the Confederate flag is more strongly linked to racial resentment than to local history. And I wondered what you guys found in regard to the flag and some of what that represents, because I think it's a perfect example of microaggression, right?
Yeah, well, so with that, they were essentially trying to look at like, is this a place that had so I think they were sort of tying it to like the history, like pre-war and what all was going on there, and seeing like, is this a place where like lots of soldiers who fought for the Confederacy were killed, and they're really trying to like honor those ancestors? Or is it more about this is a place where there's more hostility toward Black people? And that when you look at those two things in sort of competing with each other, the stronger tie to support for the Confederate flag isn't this sort of like history and ancestors. It's more about having like negative attitudes and resentment toward Black people. And there is
tied to racial disparity, correct? So the more representation of Southern heritage, there were it was more racially disparity, right?
Oh yes, yeah. There was also a paper that we talked about in there that talked about that, and that there was yeah, I'm trying to remember. I'm confusing because there's several papers that have come out on this recently. There was also another paper that I can't remember. It was published really recently. It might not have made it into our review, but where they found a link between the number of lynchings that took place in a given location and how many Confederate monuments that they had. And so essentially like showing a link between those two things, and that, essentially like places that had more racist lynchings had more Confederate monuments. So it was sort of like a symbol of like, beware, like.
Yeah, so I think we can move probably to this idea of I love this term, maybe you could say it, pathologizing the culture.
Pathologizing the culture.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what more did we say about that? I think, but yeah, tell me a little bit more about what you were saying about.
The kind of what I wanted to explore was this idea of like, also the idea of the elevation of whiteness and the kind of denigration of people of color through accents. There was also the idea of white composers being given primacy. And also police department. This is when they were talking about the police department after 9/11. So,
that was all about sort of pathologizing like cultural aspects, values, things like that. And yeah, I feel like there's just like unlimited numbers of examples once you start really thinking about this. But yeah, it's sort of like the ways in which, yeah, and thinking about the way these things are able to be said in a way that like people who perceive themselves not to be racist and don't think that they're saying anything prejudiced can repeat it. I mean, I certainly know that like growing up, I heard a lot of these things, and I don't think that the people who were saying them thought that they were telling me something racist, but the way in which, oh, well, you know, like she doesn't have good English. I don't think you should be friends with her. Like she doesn't have good English. And it's like, well, what is good English and how did it become good English? It became good English because it was what the white people were speaking. And that's, you know, how we wrote our grammar books and our dictionaries and our whatever. And then it becomes a justified way to discriminate against other people who don't speak in that same way. Then we can be like, oh, well, we can't hire them for this job. They don't, you know, speak with proper English. They, you know, you shouldn't be friends with them. You shouldn't admit them into this school. Like it becomes this very justified way to exclude and discriminate and look down upon people, which is really just like they're just have a different way of doing something that has no value on its surface. Like the only reason it has value to speak in this particular way is because we decided it did. And I think we can think about that in so many ways of like you were talking about the music of like, if you go to a music conservatory, what type of music is taught? It's like European traditions of music and of dance and of, something I was talking to my class about today of like cuisine. So like if you go to a fine dining restaurant, most fine dining restaurants in the United States are going to probably be, you know, American, like white American / probably maybe like French or some sort of like European tradition. Much less common is like a fine dining Ethiopian restaurant or a Indonesian restaurant, or, you know, like basically these other, like the rest of the world cultures and cuisines, those typically are not considered fine dining. And that isn't, you know, it's thought about and looked at very, very differently. And why is that? Like, why noting that like we associate like high status, valuable culture with, you know, white European traditions.
Right. And if it is elevated, it is done by some sort of celebrity chef. Bobby Flay does Indonesian and does, you know, deconstructs the dish and right.
Absolutely. Like it's a fusion and it's potentially is appropriation. Yeah. It's like a white person who has chosen to like bring a little bit of it in and like put it on and make it like more like raise the status of it. So it still has those same problems.
Right. I've watched enough Food Network to understand that. So the thing I wanted to kind of bring it to a close is what I think is probably the most disturbing part of the article, which is this denial of individual racism. And one of the things that I found incredible is the same actor doctrine, which you brought up at me. But there's a real sense in which, you know, saying we're not racist is enough to be not racist, but it's not really, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of our legislation, but also even just like the way that we sort of think about things is we think about racism at an individual level. Like we have a harder time thinking about it at a systemic level. That's sort of the way that we have framed like the lore about what racism is. But then also, you know, racism is these really blatant things. It's being an outspoken, like, you know, member of the KKK or something. It's like you are very like it's hate, it's violence, it's these really, really extreme things. And therefore, all of the stuff that like the majority of the things that uphold the system don't fit into that category. So they can sort of just go along. So the same actor doctrine you're bringing up. So that's, you know, where somebody can essentially have kind of, I don't know if it's quite called legal immunity. I don't think it technically is immunity, but the idea is that it's a very strong defense that if you hire a person, but then that person claims that you behave in a discriminatory way toward them in the workplace, that you can be like, no, I couldn't, be discriminatory toward you because I hired you. So basically it's like a get out of jail free card. You can't really be prosecuted for being discriminatory because you did this first thing of hiring the person in the first place. So that sort of like proved that you were not discriminatory, you were not racist by hiring them. And I think if we think about like the way a lot of hiring sort of situations work, where like there's certainly an issue in tons of institutions with retention of people of, various different marginalized groups, but certainly thinking about people of color. And I think that there's lots that can go into that, but also it's sort of this notion of like, we're not really doing anything to make it a safe space and a good environment where you want to stay. And also that we can kind of behave in any way we like, because we did this first thing of showing we're not racist by hiring you, but not really doing a whole lot to keep that up once you're actually there.
Right. And that leads to a whole, how many, that leads to a whole set of other problems that we probably don't have time to talk about. It, creating a culture within the workforce that is friendly to and supportive of means getting rid of a lot of this color, what is in the paper called false color blindness. Mm-hmm. But I also kind of wanted to just touch on one other thing, because I hear a lot within our discussions and things about this. Why can't we just be based on what you bring to the table and, skill and merit instead of all these other things? Why do we need, and I think it's incorporated in this myth of mediocrity, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. I think this one's really important. So yeah, the myth of meritocracy, I think that is sort of a really believing in meritocracy is sort of like a key belief in US society of people, things should be given to people based on merit. We shouldn't just do handouts. And I think if we look back over history, that's virtually never happened. Things have never actually been given out strictly based on merit. And in fact, there are tons of things. If we look over history, the majority of US history, there have been a lot of things that have been given to white people just for being white, of different sort of giving land, giving different sort of things at various parts, westward expansion, different parts of history and trying to get Europeans to come over and just colonize and take over the land in the early, pre-revolutionary period. So there's been so many things like that. We haven't been doing it based on meritocracy. We've been doing giving people benefits based on their race, based on their gender. And then sort of at some point within the last, 100-ish years, a little bit less than that, we started going, wait, no, it should be based on merit. Once we started opening up technically, allowing women to be in places, going to universities, be in workplaces, allowing people of color to have citizenship and be in these places. And then now we're kind of going, wait, it needs to be based on merit. And I think that there's a lot of problems with that, but one thing is that, we are not all starting in the same place. So different people have a lot more systemic and structural disadvantages that they're working to overcome to get to the same financial place, to get to the same sort of educational place as other people in other demographics. But then also there's the notion as if there is some totally, truly objective way to assess these things, whereas most of the time there's some subjectivity in judgments, and we might be looking at how well someone conforms to some of these things we were talking about of cultural values, of how well do you sort of speak properly and different things like that, where it's only merit when you look at it at a really narrow cultural lens of like, you are meriting it within my personal worldview of what I see as valuable. If we broaden that lens, it gets a lot harder to defend that.
Thank you for this. And I wish maybe you could have something that would give us a positive uplift in all of this, as to what we could do to maybe change our behaviors and be more aware of our own microaggressions toward each other.
Well, I guess what I hope with all of this work is that, if you do think that this is important information and valuable to learn about, then like there's so many different little pieces to think about. And I think that hopefully that can, for me, the more I think about these things, the more I can recognize ways in which they have been operating that I previously had not been noticing or doing anything about. And so it's like empowering me to go, oh, that has happened, in my presence before, and maybe I didn't even notice it, and I didn't do anything about it, and I didn't point it out, and I didn't work against it. And so the more aware we are of these things, like we can sort of reprogram our minds to not just go along with it, but also we can take actions to challenge that system in the way that it's perpetuating things. So I like to think of it as like a tool that we can use to empower ourselves to change ourselves, our social environments, but also, broader systems, because we all, make up broader systems, even if it's just the way we vote, but also, many of us do other things that end up having more influence and more power. So take that knowledge to make the system not be this way anymore.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.